So the next one we're going to talk about is drilling. Now, notice I'm not specifying what we're drilling for because a lot of people, when they hear that phrase, they think it actually means oil, but it can also mean gas. Another thing that we often think of is oil rigs when we hear like oil. So these, if you're not familiar with what an oil rig is, it's one of these things. It's like a huge sort of pontoon that sits out to sea. Sometimes they're quite close to the shore. Sometimes they're quite far out. And there's different types of them. There's different sizes of them as well. They are like either floating on the water, or they're and then anchored to the seabed, or they are actually mounted on the seabed if they're in shallow water. So it depends. It depends where they're located in the water conditions. And what these things do is they just have a massive long drill that just goes down under the water until it hits the Earth's crust, and then it starts drilling down into the Earth's crust until it hits the oil field. And the way that they find these oil fields is using things like sonar and ultrasound and things like that. So there's a lot of work that like Shell and BP do into trying to find where these oil fields are. And then they kind of protect it. Well, like we say protect, they sort of reserve the right to drill in these oil fields. So it's drilling at sea is problematic in its own way, because obviously you've got the technicalities of storms and swell and rough seas and all that kind of thing can affect like the drilling. So if you've got a massive long drill, if there's a lot of waves coming at the oil rig, it's obviously going to bend and move the oil rig around. So it can actually have quite a lot of effect. And these things are dangerous. Like this image down here shows one that's set on fire. And and the whole thing blew up, and you can see it starts to collapse and sink. And it's pretty horrific to look at, actually, that image, because it's such a massive thing that starts sinking in the water. So oil rigs, they're pretty bad. And also there's another massive problem with drilling at sea, which is the risk of oil spillages. Now these can happen in a number of ways. Sometimes the way they happen is where the actual drill penetrates the Earth's crust. Sometimes if there's not a good seal made around the drill for them to then extract the oil, what that will then do is it will then cause like a leak to come out. And there was a massive issue when Obama was president in the US. I can't remember when it was, but one of the Shell-owned oil rigs had been drilling for oil, and they hit an oil field, and then suddenly I think the drill actually broke, and then there was just huge quantities, like gallons and tons of oil leaking out of the Earth's crust. And it comes out at high pressure because obviously it's just literally buried underground, and it just was coming out into the ocean. And it was like this disaster that happened, and they really had to like work quick to try and literally plug the leak to stop it from leaking out. So that's a huge problem. And when oil leaks happen, they can happen on oil tankers as well, like big ships that go and collect the oil from the rigs. If those ships crash, or those ships they capsize or something, then you get oil spills on the surface of the water. And the trouble is, because the oil will sort of float around on the water, you then get creatures like fish and birds and other marine life that they'll just come into contact with it. And it's nasty stuff, crude oil. When it's raw like that, it's really thick. It's like tar, like really thick black, like a tar-like substance. And if, say, a bird like seagulls, if they go and land on the water where there's crude oil floating on the surface, that then actually damages the sort of natural protective layers that their feathers have on their wings. And it then means that they can't fly, or their wings will stick together, or they can't open them anymore. And even worse, it breaks down their insulation on their feathers as well. So they actually start getting cold, and they might even sink. So it's really nasty stuff. So this has to be managed very, very carefully. But the ocean is not the only place that we find oil and gas. Obviously, we get it on land too. Now, this is obviously a very controversial issue right now, because with certain conflict going on, it's exposed the fact that many, many nations around the world, their huge reliance on gas, natural gas and crude oil, comes from a certain country. And that certain country does mine, or they drill a huge amount. They export a massive amount of crude oil and gas. And so it's made a lot of countries realize, wow, we actually rely on, say, 80% of our oil and gas comes from this country. And it's difficult to transport, like whether you're transporting it in containers, or you're transporting it via pipelines. Like these things, they are risky. You know, there's very volatile substances that they're carrying. They can combust very, very easily, and equally pipelines for, say, gas can leak really easily. So these pipelines have to be monitored and they actually have to be protected. So if you've got a massive long gas pipeline that's going across a continent, you know, these pipelines have to be protected and they have to be checked and looked after, because if there was sabotage to them, or if there was a landslide or an earthquake, the pipe could become damaged and it could start just leaking out gas into the air. So, and natural gas doesn't really smell. That's the problem. So when you smell it, if you have natural gas hobs at home, you'll sometimes hear if the hob's been left on for too long, it has a sort of, when we say like a gassy smell, it has this sort of propane smell to it. Now they deliberately add that smell to it so that you will know if there is a gas leak, but raw natural gas doesn't really have any odor, so it's very hard to detect for humans if there's been a gas leak. Yeah, so this is basically the issues. And with oil and gas, I mean, I'd say it's arguably almost more than mining. It's because oil is literally liquid gold. We use it for so many things, like for the production of polymers, like kerosene, aviation fuel for aircraft, petrol, diesel for regular vehicles, marine diesel. Like so many things come from crude oil, and natural gas is used for a huge amount as well. So. And these things are non-renewable. They release out greenhouse gases when they're burned. They're bad stuff generally for the environment, and bad in many ways, from the extraction to the refining to the actual usage of them. It's bad all the way. So hopefully, the certain conflict that's going on at the moment might make certain countries realize that they rely too heavily on these natural resources, fossil fuels, and it's time to try and move to clean energy. Another area where you get a lot of crude oil is in desert areas, specifically the Middle East. There's a huge amount of drilling. Now, that's obviously where countries like the UAE and Qatar, they've made most of their money has been made off of oil. They've got massive oil fields out in the desert. So instead of an oil rig, they literally just have a big drill that would go down into the ground and it will extract all the oil. And that oil, it's been doing them well. It's been supplying them a lot, but obviously, oil is expensive, it's precious. Well, it's expensive because it's in such high demand and it is running out. And as it starts to run out even more, the price will keep going up. And then that's, at the moment, we're experiencing a huge increase in petrol prices because there's problems with oil due to a certain conflict happening. But also, I mean, you could argue that not that many, there's not that much natural wildlife that lives in deserts, but oil can be found as well under forests and literally anywhere. I mean, wherever there's life, there's going to be destruction of some sort to access the oil. So if it's a forest, they'll need to deforest that whole area to then be able to set up their drilling equipment so they can then drill into the ground and get the oil. So oil is literally, it's like probably along with diamonds and stuff and gold, maybe it's probably one of the most conflict causing natural resources that we have, because companies will try and buy entire oil fields to try and secure their oil supply. And this was a big problem with like the Iraq War and things like that. There was a lot of oil was hanging in the balance there, and it's all very, very political. So the quicker that humans can move away from reliance on crude oil and gas and natural gas, the better.